Hi everyone. Honestly, I've had to take a minute to calm down a little bit because I've read yet another case of teenage thugs getting a tap on the wrist for a very destructive, heinous, evil crime. And it just makes my blood boil, to be quite honest. It really, really makes my blood boil. I mean, I've calmed down a little bit now, but this is how I feel about it. So I'm just going to read out the report. This is from BBC London. And here we go. I'll try and put a link if I can, but it's a Facebook link, so that's not always the easiest one to link up. Anyway, BBC London today. Two teenagers have been locked up for a firework attack which led to the death of a widower in his terrace home in East London. In the years leading up to the attack, Robert Price, 76, had been the target of a prolonged campaign of harassment and criminal damage to Old Bailey was told. Nathan Otedod Delajukwu, 18, and a 16-year-old who cannot be named due to his age, threatened to torch the pensioner before punching a hole in his window and pushing fireworks into his box. There's a white segment behind it that's covering that text on the Oval Road in can't see that clearly. Unfortunately, the text is covered by a white background. Anyway, it happened in London. The pair had admitted manslaughter and were sentenced on Monday by Judge Rebecca Trowler KC. Otedod Dilchukwu was jailed for 6 years and the youth was handed a custodial sentence of 2 years and 8 months. 2 years and 8 months for killing a man. These evil little bastards should have got 15 years each minimum. But Rebecca Trowler, KC, you're absolutely useless. You're a disgrace. And you personify how useless judges in this country really are. I'm so disgusted because this is what the British people have to put up with. You know, I'm going to let rip with this one. I just don't care. I'm fuming. This poor man would have been... This wasn't an isolated incident. This poor man, this elderly man, was harassed by these evil little shits. East London, that's the specific destination. Now, some people were homing in on one of the thugs' names. It's obviously not a British name. I would imagine that's a West African name. But honestly, if it was Sunderland or another city in the north, the chances are the thug would be white. So I wouldn't read too much into that. The real problem here is accountability of judges, of a justice system that just doesn't get reality. What we have in this country is a situation where teenage thugs run wild, and if they commit a heinous crime, I mean, taking someone's life is the worst thing you could do. The most they can expect is a few years behind bars. So if that's the price for taking someone's life, then you can imagine anything less than that, and I say less without any interest in trivializing it, because God knows prolonged antisocial behaviour, prolonged harassment can destroy lives. But 6 years for killing someone, so it'll be a tap on the wrist for almost everything else. And there's footage here, I'm watching it right now. The horrible little bastards are... the guy's home is already bricked up, so that's presumably from the previous attacks, the previous examples of harassment. It so infuriates me that we have a justice system that doesn't understand that the public demand, the public want to see, the public demand, and the public are right to expect much, much tougher penalties. How can this be a deterrent? How can taking a man's life resulting in 6 years be a deterrent? Like I say, I think 15 years would be more realistic. But we're a very long way off that ever happening. And 2 years, 8 months for the 16-year-old thug? Now, bear in mind, this is a government that's just brought in votes for 16-year-olds. The youth who cannot be named for legal reasons. So this evil little monster will be out of jail before he's 20. Judge Rebecca Trowler lives on another planet, because if she had the guts to actually be true to her job, she would be challenging such lenient sentencing. But judges, I don't think, have guts. I think British judges, for the most part, are utterly useless. I really think very little of them as a profession. The reason being that they always say that their hands are tied. They say that they have to work within the guidelines. Well, if they really believe that their hands are tied, if they would like to enforce tougher sentencing, they would be kicking up a stink. They would be putting pressure on the Sentencing Council, which is another useless organisation, to actually put forward much tougher guidelines. They're not doing it. At least they're not doing it anywhere near the sort of level that the public would like to see. And when I say the public, I'm talking about the majority. Obviously, people are going to have different opinions. Some people will be sympathetic to teenage thugs. I sure as hell am not. I don't care what sob stories they have in their background. This is evil. Imagine if you're watching this and you're around my age, imagine that's your father or your grandfather. It's so depressing and so infuriating and so consistent. It never changes. We hear that sentencing has slightly increased from 10 years ago, but it's so small that it makes no difference. Certainly makes no difference to public opinion. What we need to see is significantly tougher sentences, I would say, for a crime like this. Yeah, I think 15 years is about right. And being realistic, hell, if it has to be less than that, then at least 10 years. But 2 years, 8 months, and 6 years is nothing. It's absolutely nothing. The 16-year-old thug will be smiling. Rebecca Trowler will be complacent in her little bubble on her other planet, because she's another example of a useless judge. And of course she's unaccountable. You can't elect these people. Judges might claim that they're unfairly blamed for lack of trust in the justice system. They say their hands are tied. But the fact of the matter is they're not elected. They're not accountable. That's just the reality. Call that populism, but it's the reality. They're not elected. Who are they accountable to? The only way a judge can be dismissed is for professional misconduct. As for public empowerment, any of us can write to the Attorney General to request a review of an unduly lenient sentence, but the vast majority of the time, nothing changes. That was the case in the Bim Coley case in Leicester, where that was reviewed for undue leniency. Again, the arrogant Court of Appeal judge decided that she wasn't going to increase the sentence because she's arrogant. She represents the judicial establishment in this country. I don't think these people live in the real world. Or perhaps more accurate, they do understand public opinion, they just don't care. I really genuinely believe we have a legal establishment in this country that has a contempt for the public. They really, really do, because we see this so often. Is it in every single case? No. I'm not saying every single criminal case results in a disproportionate sentence. Sometimes the sentence is about right. But when it comes to youth crime, when it comes to teenagers terrorising adults, you can be damn sure they'll get a tap on the wrist. And that's rotten. It's wrong. What you just know is if this elderly gentleman had defended himself, he'd be looking at charges. So I think there's something fundamentally rotten in our justice establishment. It makes my blood boil. And when someone like Lord Timpson claims we punish too many people, again, Lord Timpson lives on another planet. I mean, when you have a criminal sympathiser like Timpson in a position of power, what does that tell you? Now, some people might not like the tone of this video. They might think I'm just being an angry populist. But I am sick of it. And I felt this way for a very long time. There's no nuance here. The footage speaks for itself. Some people have asked how can they be identified because they're in balaclavas, and chances are they have very long criminal records. Because, like I say, teenage thugs act with impunity in this country. There's no deterrent. There really isn't. You know, the police get a lot of criticism, but when the police do arrest them and then they appear before a judge, it's the judge. It's the judge that makes a decision to give them a tap on the wrist. Now, a judge with guts would have given these evil killers a much, much longer sentence, but this judge is useless. She is absolutely useless. Shame on you, Rebecca Trowther. If I was related to the victim, I would just feel utter disgust. I do. I don't even know the man, but that's beside the point. And you know, the most depressing thing about this is it's hard to see how it changes. Now, reform is talking tough on crime. What I want to know is the details. I don't criticise the rhetoric. I think it is actually justified. And believe me, I do not agree with everything that reform comes out with. Far from it. But this is a subject I feel so strongly about that if reform actually done something about this, if they shook up the system to the point where criminals started feeling scared for once, that would be no bad thing. The other parties need to get a grip. You know, Labour has bipolar disorder when it comes to crime. No disrespect to people with bipolar disorder. I'm using it as an analogy, right? Because on one hand, perhaps that was flippant of me, I apologise, but, you know, I'm just angry right now. On one hand, they say that they're tough on crime. They use the tough rhetoric. And yet, Starmer says he stands by and he's proud of his choice of Lord Timpson as Prisons Minister. I think it's deeply concerning that a government minister says we punish too many criminals. It shows that Timpson is a criminal sympathiser. Timpson wouldn't believe that these evil scumbags should get longer than what they got. I'm pretty confident in saying that. You know, if Timpson was looking at this case, he'd say they're minors, they've done a terrible thing, but the sentence is about right. I am convinced he would say that. And it just proves that he doesn't live on this planet. I am so disgusted by the arrogance of our legal establishment. I think these people need to be forced to have a reality check. I'm not talking about any violence. I'm not advocating any violence. You know, I'd be a hypocrite because I've condemned incitement. Well, I still condemn incitement. I'm not inciting anything. Everything must be peaceful. But I think peaceful protests would be justified. You know, we've seen all these protests against migrant hotels. Where's the protests outside courts? Where's the protests? I suppose the argument would be it would disrupt proceedings and then that wouldn't necessarily help victims. But the issue here is the British people have just put up with it for decades. We've just put up with a rotten criminal justice system that puts the rights of criminals before victims. That routinely gives young offenders a tap on the wrist. And I do home in on that issue because adult offenders will get a much tougher sentence now. I know a 16-year-old isn't going to get the same as a 36-year-old, but should be a hell of a lot tougher than it is. That to me is empirically obvious. It is so infuriating. And what can we do? What power does the public have? Like I say, writing to the Attorney General to refer these things to the Court of Appeal is utterly useless. The Court of Appeal has contempt for the public. They do not care. They just don't care. That's what's infuriating about these people. They don't care. I genuinely believe they have a contempt for the public, because if they genuinely cared, they would do something about it. That's just obvious. If they cared about how the public felt, if they wanted to be more representative, if they wanted to listen to public opinion, they would drastically increase sentences. Legislators would increase sentences. The Sentencing Council would increase sentences. We don't see it happening. So one can only conclude that we have a judicial establishment that just does not care. They're the ones in the power, so to hell with the rest of us. I'm going to wrap this up because I'm just going to be ranting. And I guess I have been ranting, but honestly I am livid. I told myself reading this, okay, I'm not going to get worked up. It's, you almost say you need to desensitize yourselves to this stuff, but it's very, very difficult if you have a conscience, if you're a decent person, not to feel infuriated by it. What's going to change? Like I say, reform talks tough, but language is one thing. I want to see the details. How is Nigel Farage going to shake up the system without being accused of interfering in the judiciary? How is he going to, at the moment he's being a politician, he's criticising Labour, he's criticising other parties, but politicians can criticise each other. I think the whole system needs shaken up. And the problem is whenever any politician criticises judges or the Sentencing Council, they immediately scream about interfering in the judiciary. They're self-interested. They're utterly interested in protecting themselves. Now, the way I see it is politicians are elected by the people. You might not like politicians, but there is a difference. If you don't like a particular politician, you can vote them out of office. We can't do that with Lord Timpson because he's a peer. But if you feel your MP is out of touch, vote them out of office. You can't do that with judges. I do sometimes wonder, should we look at the American system where judges could be voted in? Now, to be fair, American judges aren't necessarily always in touch with public opinion either. There was a case in Charlotte, North Carolina recently. A young Ukrainian woman was killed, and it turns out that the mentally ill killer had been recently released, despite clearly posing a threat to the public. I personally feel that any parole officer or judge who lets out a dangerous individual and they go on to kill someone or seriously injure someone, that should be a sackable offence. This is the sort of thing that people think about. But like I say, in this country, the only way a judge can be held to account is for professional misconduct. Now, some people will say, oh, Nathan, you're generalising all judges. There's good judges as well. I'm sure there are. But unless they're speaking up, then it doesn't count for anything. It's a bit like you have good police officers who want to get back to basics policing. But if they're not condemning, if they're not recognising the anger the public has with the waste of time policing, policing people for thoughts or for non-crime hate incidents, if they're not speaking out on that, if they're not recognising the connection between public mistrust and those sort of issues, they can't really complain. Of course, not all judges are bad. I'll say it, not all judges are bad. But there is enough of them that are tone deaf, that are not doing enough to address public anger, that it's fair to say, it's fair to make a generalisation in this context, because I think sometimes all my life I've been against generalisations. I've said, no, it's ignorant, you can't lump the whole group as one, and that's fundamentally true. But sometimes, you need to be a little bit crude and a little bit populist just to shake things up a bit and to force the decent judges onto the defensive. Yeah, so I'm forcing them onto the defensive with this video. I'm saying to them, you think my criticism's unfair? Then get your act together and do something. Nothing ever changes. And it just makes me hopping mad because the public have no empowerment. And I think in a democracy, the public should have empowerment. I'm not saying we should have justice by mob. That's not what I'm suggesting. But we should have a justice system that is a hell of a lot more reflective than it currently is. And, you can look back 3 decades, 4 decades, it hasn't really changed. That's not strictly true, actually. If we go back perhaps to circa the 60s, that liberal opening up in the 60s, I think, may have been the changing point. Probably from the 60s, 70s onwards is when we started seeing more and more leniency. and something fundamentally changed in that era. The death penalty was abolished in the 60s. Now, I am against the death penalty fundamentally because I think if mistakes are made, there's no going back. But we can correlate that opening up of the 60s to a trajectory where justice has just been consistently lenient. In the past, you may have had examples, for instance, in the 18th century, a lot of crimes went unpunished because there was no operating police force. But you know, the Victorians were condemned a lot for being very harsh. Um, is that a more callous situation than having a system where victims routinely feel utterly let down? You know, is a Victorian tough on crime model really more inhumane than the system that routinely ignores victims, that routinely gives callous thugs a sentence that just does not reflect the seriousness of the crime? I'm not convinced that today's system is morally superior to that. I really don't think it is. Not when it so routinely lets people down, not when the majority of the public feel disgusted by it. There's something fundamentally undemocratic about that, and it has to change. Reform, like I say, Farage is claiming they'll be the toughest party ever on law and order. Well, we've heard politicians talk tough for decades. I think the only way this system changes is for a fundamental shake-up, which will mean fundamental constitutional change. So be it. That's what has to happen. It has to be peaceful, but it has to happen. We need a shake-up in the system. We need judges to feel that their jobs will be on the line if they're consistently soft. We need the Sentencing Council to be forced to start reflecting public opinion a hell of a lot more than they are. Their public consultations count for nothing because it doesn't cover every crime and it changes very little. It really does. Legislators who talk tough need to show that they're going to back it up because words are cheap. And with that, I'll round this up. I'll be 40 in 2 days, so I've told myself in my 40s I'm going to try not to overthink the subject. I'm going to try and not think about it so much, and I will try. It ain't good for your mental health, but I can't change my fundamental conviction on this. It's just wrong. And I'm not saying, lock them up and throw away the keys. I'm just saying, all I'm saying is we need to have sentences that match the gravity of the crime. And far, far too often right now they don't, especially with teenage thugs. A 16-year-old can legally vote, but according to our justice establishment, they're going to be treated like an innocent child who cannot be named for legal reasons, and they're going to be given a couple of years for taking a man's life. That is wrong. It's simply wrong. Shame on you, Rebecca Trowler Casey. You're a disgrace. And you personify why people are infuriated with the justice system.